I know we don't know everything about this, but tell us what we do know at this point. Do we know who is behind it? Do we know how long the shutdown's likely to last?
Yeah, we know that there have been reports of this rogue cyber group out of Eastern Europe. Some have attributed it to Russia. We're still making sure to try to confirm that. We also know that so far the supply has not been impacted, supply of gas. But if it goes on too long, of course, that will change. We know right now that we haven't seen big price spikes or anything as a result of this. And we know that the company is doing everything it can to look under the hood of its systems to make sure that they have been able to contain and that the cyber attack did not inject any malicious malware into the system. They believe that they will probably have make a substantial restoration, I'll say, by the end of this week. So hopefully this will be a short-term disruption that won't really impact the lives of everyday citizens, hopefully. But I will say, David, that it speaks to the broader issue, that this issue of cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure, especially energy infrastructure, is not going away. This is a serious example of what we're seeing across the board in many places. And it tells you that we need to invest in our systems, our transmission grid for electricity. We need to invest in cyber defense in these energy systems. The private sector has to step up to the plate. Many are, but there's quite a few who have been slow to do so. And I think that these will serve as examples of why it's important to accelerate.
I understand that Colonial now is saying they plan to have service restored perhaps by the end of this week. But pick up on your point, Madam Secretary, about where else we might have vulnerabilities. Even before we know exactly what happened, I know you as a leader, your first question is going to be, okay, who else do we have to look at to make sure we don't get hit somewhere else? When you really responded to this, what industries did you look to? What companies did you look to?
Well, clearly, the broad array of energy infrastructure. So we had this example of solar winds, which was an attack on the transmission grid. Fortunately, that didn't bring down the system, but it tells you how utterly vulnerable we are. We're seeing all of these examples of ransomware attacks coming, whether it's telecommunications or this critical infrastructure. To me, obviously in my lane, I'm very worried about the energy infrastructure. We don't want to see people lose access to the means to travel, which is what the Colonial Pipeline is, or the means to be able to heat their homes or have energy for communicating for businesses or whatever. So this is why, the president has put out this agenda of the American Jobs Plan. And one of the components of that is to invest in our transmission grid, to harden our transmission grid, to make it more resilient to these adverse adverse weather impacts, climate impacts, but also to make sure that it's resilient from cyber attacks. So it's another reason why we've got to invest in these critical components of our infrastructure in order to be secure.
So it's not lost on any of us that this does happen at the time the American Jobs Plan is right up there in Capitol Hill being proposed. Yeah. Help us understand what in the American Jobs Plan specifically might protect us against something like what is going on with Colonial right now.
Yeah, one of the things that is a critical piece of this is a suggested investment in the transmission grid, for example. And that transmission grid, you saw how vulnerable it was in Texas from that wild weather event that happened, the storm in Texas. So that's one component. And we saw how vulnerable it was with respect to solar winds and the cyber attack. This component, this investment, which is part of the American Jobs Plan, will allow us to ensure that we can harden the grid from these kind of adverse events. And that's what's really important. It's one of the reasons, the president is meeting this week with members of Congress about the American Jobs Plan. He's meeting with Republicans. He's meeting with Democrats. He's entertaining counter proposals. He's really serious about getting bipartisan support. And on the transmission grid, David, I think this is one area where, even though it's not roads and bridges, it is infrastructure, and it's one of the areas that I think we'll see some bipartisan support on.
So finally, the last one on Colonial specifically, what things are you at least considering, depending on how this plays out? You've already suspended some rules about trucking. What about the Jones Act? There's a lot of talk about that, shipping in with non-U.S. flagships. What about using some of the petroleum reserves? As I understand, there is some refined petroleum reserves on the East Coast.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely petroleum reserves. And if it gets to that, certainly that'll be one thing to consider. You know, the Jones Act, as you say, would allow non-US ships to be able to import oil and gas. But I don't want to get ahead of things because right now, that would require a waiver. The Department of Transportation did issue a waiver yesterday that would allow longer term trucking, the ability for truckers to be on the road longer to ship, to transport gasoline. But you know, there's a suite of things that you can consider to ratchet up depending on what happens, but we're not at that point yet. We're hopeful that we'll be able to see this pipeline restored by weekend.
Madam Secretary, let's turn to the broader issue, that big agenda you had before this came up, which is the
Yeah.
clean energy goals of the Biden administration. President Biden has certainly made this a top priority. Give us a sense of what is on the table in terms of getting it done. We've set some ambitious goals for ourselves to really cut back and then eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. For example, carbon price. Are we going to get a carbon price and when?
Yeah, that has not been one of the president's proposals. What he has proposed is to put out goals and to help finance the means to get to those goals. So, for example, his goal is 100% clean electricity by 2035 and 100% carbon-free but energy system by 2050. And what he's done through the American Jobs Plan is to help finance the technologies that would allow us to get here. So the Department of Energy has got 17 national labs working on these next generation technologies that will help to lower the price of those technologies. Like we just announced a new goal to lower again the cost of solar by 60% by 2030. The lower the cost, obviously, the greater uptake there will be. I mean, soon solar and wind, and in many places this is already true, are cheaper than any other form of energy. But one of the things that's preventing the solar and wind from being able to be deployed is capacity on the electric grid. So again, it gets back to making sure that we're able to expand that electric grid so that solar and wind can get on. And just quickly, there's all these next generation technologies that the US doesn't use that much. For example, geothermal. Well, that's established technology where you pull energy from the core of the earth. They use it in other countries a lot, but we haven't in this country. So we at the Department of Energy put out grants to be able to ensure that we can have demonstration projects and deployment of that kind of technology. We're all about both development of the technology and deployment of that technology.
Madam Secretary, the president and you have emphasized that this can generate jobs. Far from losing jobs, could actually create jobs. At the same time, do we need a border adjustment tax to make sure those jobs don't escape the United States as a practical matter? We talked with Secretary Kerry, who said that he thought that may be something that the president would consider.
Yeah, I mean, the president is open to a whole array of things that will incentivize the job creation in the United States. That, you know, as you know, there was also a global minimum tax that the president put on the table in terms of how to finance the American Jobs Plan. You know, and members of Congress have put on the table a border adjustment tax. It's not what the president has put on yet, but it may be something that he would consider in his negotiations. He's very flexible. He just wants to see this once in a lifetime, once in at least 2 generations, maybe, investment in America because of our economic competitors. Our economic competitors are out there investing in these technologies and have, for example, China has a strategic plan to corner the market on key technologies that are important for the globe's economic future, but certainly in the US. If China wants to corner the market on electric vehicles and the batteries for those vehicles, then we don't have the ability to build them, to put people to work in them, to make ourselves energy independent. So we've got to invest in our country, in our people, in our ability to have these energy technologies and not just stand by and watch our economic competitors eat us for lunch. So he's open. But what he doesn't want to do is let this moment go by. The only red line the president has is inaction.
The ultimate goal here, recognizing it's going to take some time, is net zero emissions. Can we get there without nuclear? I know you've testified just recently at Capitol Hill about possible subsidies for nuclear.
Yeah, nuclear is an incredibly important component of In fact, it's the largest clean energy generator right now in our energy portfolio. But so we can't get there without nuclear. We can't get there without all of the above, though. I would say nuclear is a critically important piece. So is solar, so is wind. So is the ability to manage carbon, to manage CO2 emissions. And that might be the technology that you would attach to natural gas, for example, to take away carbon from their emissions. Or frankly, we need to work as well on methane emissions, which is another greenhouse gas that's even more important than carbon dioxide. So this whole suite of technologies should be on the table, but you cannot eliminate clearly one that works, which is nuclear.